It was supposed to be a regular workday. I was on the technical crew at a PR agency, responsible for prep work on promotional videos filmed in Hollywood for years. The agency had announced that 3 celebrity volunteers would be joining the same project for a post-earthquake awareness campaign. Vanessa Hudgens, Demi Lovato, and Keanu Reeves. All 3 had joined the project for different reasons, and since their schedules were tight, we needed to film the shoot within the city limits, in a spacious and quiet location. This led the team to select a long vacant property in the upper reaches of Los Angeles. The house had belonged to a Hollywood producer in the 1980s. But after the owner's death, the mansion had sat empty for years. The agency had rented it because of its expansive interior. I arrived at the location before anyone else. The electrical system had been turned on, the lights were working, but the house still carried the scent of a place unused for years. It was as if the walls had trapped a faint dampness, and the silence of the empty rooms hit the ear like pressure. Then, the vehicles arrived one by one. I remember the exact moment that celebrities arrived, because it was impossible not to notice the mixed expressions on their faces as they walked across that vast courtyard. All 3 were professionals, accustomed to press shoots, but this house made them uneasy from the very first minute. There was an unsettling heaviness to the location's atmosphere. I could feel it too. When the owner was alive, actors and producers often gathered here. Old photographs showed laughter, crowded parties, and people milling through the corridors. But that day, the interior of the mansion was completely empty. Most of the furniture had been removed. Some rooms were locked, and others were left semi. Even though the electrical panel had been renewed, some lights flickered on their own. After the 3 celebrities entered the location, we, as a team, moved on to planning. The shoot was planned for several different rooms. While I was setting up the cables, they were touring the main hall. Normally, there would be an echo in such a large place, but the silence of this house was different. It was as if the walls were absorbing the sounds. Even footsteps came out muffled, barely audible. The first oddity began right at that moment. The old recording studio section, on the lower floor of the house, was closed off, with a heavy door that hadn't been opened for years. According to the files, a security system had briefly been activated in that room years ago, and the door had locked itself. It was supposed to be locked that day too, but the door was ajar. Moreover, a faint light was seeping out from inside. The light being on made no sense. The electricians had checked all the circuits that morning and said there was no power running to that section, but the light was flickering faintly. I noticed it but didn't say anything. I watched silently. Then Vanessa stopped and looked at the door. Demi turned her face towards the door, alert. Keanu Reeves, however, simply studied that flickering light for a long time without saying a word. All 3 had felt the same thing. I could read the single thought running through my mind on their faces. Something is here. The slight draft of cold air coming from the gap in the door intensified the pressure that had been felt. Since the moment we first stepped inside, there were no other people in the house. Security cameras showed empty corridors, but that light, that door, that cold air, it was like a sign of something unseen, but definitely present. It was in that moment that I felt we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that feeling was just a small warning compared to what we would experience in the following minutes. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this, because now I'm going to tell you what was behind that door and how the event I witnessed with the 3 celebrities spiraled out of control. The light seeping out from the crack in the door was almost like an invitation. But my instincts told me that this invitation came with a palpable danger. As we all approached the door, we carefully scrutinized our surroundings, though I don't know if they noticed. My heart pounded rapidly as I stayed back, checking the equipment. The air inside was different, cold, yet suffocating. It felt as if breathing was becoming difficult, and my chest was tightening. The source of the light was still not visible, but faint clicking and scraping sounds, like metal rubbing against metal, drew attention. When you listened to the silence, even tiny sounds felt like screams. As Demi Lovato walked around the room, I felt an invisible eye following her. The floorboards beneath our feet were old, but sometimes we heard creaks independent of our steps, and sounds from the door hinges. There were logical explanations, but none could encompass the entire situation. At that moment, I noticed an object slightly move on its own in the room where Vanessa Hudgens was standing. A picture frame on a table slid horizontally without any visible force, and the lid of an old record player slowly opened and closed. As Demi Lovato examined the stairs in the back, she felt a sudden cold wave. I saw her gasp. Keanu Reeves, looking at the camera, had a brief look of surprise flash across his face, but he didn't utter a word. For me, the situation was clear. There was a presence inside the house that couldn't be explained by logic, though the celebrities who came for the shoot were unaware. This presence was following their every move. These were small signs that broke the silence but indicated the existence of something unseen. A faint clatter coming from a corner of the room made my heart nearly stop. My reflex was to check the equipment in my hand, but I couldn't move. It was as if the shadows had taken shape to restrict my movement. With every step, with every breath, I noticed it more. And unseen, I was focused on the three celebrities, and we had entered its game without realizing it. This feeling is hard to describe. Logical explanations fall short, but even though it was invisible, the presence's effect was felt every second. I thought then, this house might have been empty for years, but the energy within it and the traces left by the past were still active. The three celebrities had consciously come only for a promotional shoot, but the house had begun to test them on its own terms, and right at this point, more intense and uncontrolled events were about to begin in the minutes that followed. Shadows were beginning to shift, and lights were flickering on and off by themselves. I waited and observed quietly, because all I could do was watch what would happen next. When our footsteps landed on the stone floor of the room, the sounds didn't just echo, they seemed to receive an answer. The faint creaks from the stairs carried a rhythm that made it feel as if someone or something was watching us. Lights flickered on their own, and shadows moved beyond the norm. Objects on the table suddenly shifted. Picture frames and small accessories moved unnoticed. Sometimes, only a shadow would dart quickly past, but my eyes couldn't catch it. This utterly demolished logical explanations and step-by-step created a breathtaking sense of fear. The door of an old cabinet, standing at the end of the hallway, opened and closed by itself. A shiver ran through me when I heard that sound. I felt a strange heaviness in my body, making even breathing difficult. The feeling that everything could spiral out of control at any moment became dominant. Suddenly, electronic devices abruptly sprang to life. Camera lights flickered, microphones hummed at an abnormal frequency, and phone screens randomly turned on and off. At that moment, I understood that this was no ordinary house. There was a living energy inside, invisible yet powerful. After taking a few steps, I noticed a silhouette in a dark corner. It wasn't a clear shape, but its presence was undeniably felt. It seemed to react to our every movement, watching our progress, testing us. It was impossible for our steps to blend into the silence. The felt presence made itself known, not just visually, but through sensation. The air in the room grew progressively colder and denser. I felt a pressure in my chest when I breathed, as if an invisible weight was pulling us down with every breath. It was as though the house wasn't just observing and evaluating our every step and decision, but was actively exerting psychological pressure. After a while, a faint clatter from inside the cabinet drew my attention. My hand instinctively reached out, but my fingers were frozen. It was as if the presence knew that the moment I saw it, I would truly realize its existence, and I was rendered unable to move. I understood then that this was not just a place, it was an entity that was living, reacting, and setting its boundaries. A voice inside me kept warning, we shouldn't go deeper, but at the same time, curiosity was unavoidable. Every corner, every shadow, every sound escalated the event. The presence's existence was now making itself felt, not just through small signs, but directly through feelings and physical occurrences. That dark corner at the end of the corridor was no longer just a shadow. It seemed to have become a distinct presence. It was following our steps, anticipating our movements, and measuring every breath. At that moment, I realized that this house was not merely an old structure. The energy within it was consciously moving to trap us. The door of one of the rooms suddenly slammed shut. The sound was so sharp and sudden that my heart leaped into my throat. When I turned back, the curtains were swaying on their own, even though there was no breeze. The lights flickered intensely and sometimes went out completely. In the darkness, the invisible entity was playing with us, testing our limits. A piece of furniture slid slightly, yet it was neither pushed nor touched by a hand. Even this simple movement sent chills down my spine. I wanted to slow my steps, but I was oscillating between curiosity and terror. The presence wasn't just observing, it was holding control. I realized then that walking down the corridor was not just moving through a space. We were undergoing a test. Every breath, every movement was being evaluated by the unseen entity. Even a faint hum coming from a corner sounded as if it was speaking directly to my mind. A light flickered, shadows raced across the wall, and suddenly an object materialized in midair. My body froze, and my fingers began to tremble. The presence of the entity was no longer just felt. It was physically demonstrating its effect. Every step had to be more cautious, every breath more measured. As the presence drew closer, the fear rising in my heart simultaneously triggered excitement. The voice inside me constantly warned, "Don't go any further." But curiosity couldn't be contained. At that moment, I understood that every corner, every shadow, and every dark area of the house was this entity's playground. Simply observing was not enough. We also had to understand the entity's rhythm and anticipate its moves. Otherwise, control would completely pass to it. As we moved down the corridor, the effect of the presence was now inescapable. With every step, a pressure was felt on the floor, as if an invisible hand was following us, measuring our every move. Room doors were opening and closing by themselves, and the ceiling lights were flickering around. While all this was happening, my gaze suddenly fell on Keanu Reeves. He looked shocked, frozen, and clearly wanted to leave. Suddenly, in an old mirror, I saw not my own reflection, but a silhouette behind me. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes, but I immediately realized this wasn't just an illusion, it was a warning. My heart pounded rapidly, and breathing became difficult. A wave of coldness emanating from the room enveloped my entire body. The energy in the air had intensified, and even without touching me, I could feel the presence's existence in every molecule. I tried to silence my steps, but they were inevitably heard. The entity was constantly monitoring our movements and responding. When I leaned down to adjust a piece of equipment, a faint shadow stirred behind me. When I turned my head, the space was empty, but the feeling of the presence dominated the entire room, a faint humming coming from the dark. Corners felt as if it was speaking directly to my mind, warning me about my next movement. Now, fear wasn't just in my mind, it was physically on us. Breathing, stepping, making any movement had become difficult. Everything in the house was no longer just a space, but a living, reacting entity. At that moment, I understood that finishing this night required more than just moving forward step by step. Every movement, every breath had consequences, and the invisible entity was reminding us of this every second. I paused at the end of the corridor and took a deep breath. The presence was still with us, but its movements had slowed, almost as if it were simply observing. It watched carefully to see which step we would take, and its way of testing our limits had changed. A room door cracked open slightly, and as I peered inside, I noticed distinct silhouettes within the darkness. The entity seemed to be measuring our reactions. Now, it required not just fear, but strategic thinking. We had to plan every step, measure every breath. I felt a wave of coolness on the floor. The presence was still beside us, but it was moving more predictably now. An object slowly shifted, but it didn't physically harm us. It was difficult to understand if this was a warning or a redirection. As I walked down the corridor, I tried to maintain our distance from the entity. My heart was still racing, but my mind was slightly clearer. I was now focused not just on survival, but on understanding the entity's boundaries. As we approached one of the room doors, the light subtly steadied, and the shadows concentrated in a specific direction. This was a change in the entity's behavioral rhythm. Thanks to this rhythm, we began to understand how we might proceed safely. With every step, the tension was still high, but now a roadmap seemed visible. The presence was still with us, but it wasn't trying to destroy us. It was seemingly measuring our limits. This realization allowed us to regain a small degree of control over the fear. I still remember that night. Fear and curiosity were intertwined with every step. The dark corners of the house, the flickering lights, and the movement of shadows now felt like a direct message from the entity. Vanessa Hudgens, Demi Lovato, and Keanu Reeves were beside me. They couldn't put what they saw into words. There was fear and shock in their eyes, but they were also trembling with the instinct for survival. We paused for a moment, holding our breath and listening to the silence. Vanessa had her hands tightly clasped. Demi was constantly scanning her surroundings, and Keanu was looking slightly behind him. Fear had immobilized them, but the curiosity in their eyes was still alive. This experience was affecting them not just physically, but spiritually as well. Each of them was simultaneously trying to predict what the entity would do in confronting their own fears. As we moved through the dark corridors of the house, we felt the entity's movements more clearly. Its presence was beside us in every breath, every step. But now there was not only fear, but also a kind of awareness. Understanding the entity's boundaries and not crossing them was the only way for us to survive. As we moved along the corridor, I realized that we weren't the only ones inside the house. With every step, I began to feel the presence's difference more intensely. Vanessa Hudgens was walking beside me. Her steps were a mixture of caution and apprehension. It was as if every corner concealed a new danger. Demi Lovato constantly scanned left and right, examining the points where light broke and where shadows moved. Though Keanu Reeves tried to appear calm, the sharp vigilance in his eyes showed he was on edge every moment. It was then I realized that this house was not just a location. It was a kind of trap, controlled by the entity, watching and testing us. The doors, the lights, and the shadows were all moving deliberately and consciously. Vanessa slowed her steps, adjusting her hair with her hands, but the tension was reflected on her face. Demi held her breath, listening carefully to every sound. Keanu, despite his composed demeanor, was constantly sweeping the surroundings with his eyes, as if trying to anticipate which direction the presence would shift next. At the end of the corridor was the door to an old living room. As we approached the door, the coolness radiating from the room felt like it was taking our breath away. Vanessa glanced slightly behind her. Fear and indecision were in her eyes. Demi paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the dark spots in the room, while Keanu silently watched them. The silence was so intense that even a faint creak from the other end of the corridor was clear enough to make our hearts jump. We approached the stairs. The old creaking steps groaned out of sync with our footfalls. Vanessa took the first step, Demi followed, and Keanu stayed slightly behind, observing our progress. Just then, I noticed a shadow moving from the upper floors. It wasn't a clear shape, but it was obvious the entity was changing its position. Vanessa flinched, taking a few steps back. Demi held her breath, while Keanu silently tracked the shadow. A faint clatter from the corner of the room caught my attention. Initially, we thought it was tricks of the ear, but the feeling that the entity was communicating with us became clearer. Vanessa took smaller steps. Demi supported herself against the wall as she moved, while Keanu, cool-headed but alert, guided us. We were aware now. This entity was measuring our movements and testing our decisions. At the end of the corridor was an old door. We couldn't see inside, but the entity seemed to have directed us there. Vanessa approached the door. Demi walked silently beside her, and Keanu stayed slightly back, observing their movements. Just as we reached out our hands to the door, an intense wave of coldness radiating from the room took our breath away. Vanessa, trembling, opened the door. Demi squinted as she moved forward, and Keanu slowly pushed the door open. The inside of the room felt like a place where time had stopped. Shadows moved on the walls, lights flickered deliberately. Vanessa looked around with fear. Demi silently breathed, and Keanu was calm but vigilant. The presence of the entity was now palpable. Even the rhythm of our breathing seemed dependent on its awareness. Fear and astonishment were on Vanessa's face. Demi showed a mix of anxiety and alertness, and Keanu was a blend of caution and composure. As we all moved forward silently, the entity continued to watch us from a step behind. This experience was not just fear, it was a situation testing our limits, awareness, and courage. With every step, the fear, the unknown, and the tension intensified. As we proceeded into the room, I started seeing strange shapes on the walls and floors. Vanessa noticed them and flinched, while Demi carefully tried to understand what they were. Keanu was silent, but his eyes constantly measured the entity's movements. For a moment, as if the entity was reacting to our movements, the lights started flickering faster, and the shadows spread more sharply into the corners of the room. Vanessa panicked. Demi clasped her hands together, and Keanu was analyzing the situation calmly but clearly. With every step, the entity's awareness seemed to increase, as if it were tracking our breath. Vanessa's trembling steps, Demi's careful observations, Keanu's vigilant stance, all were like a game for the entity. We slowed our steps, controlled our breathing, and advanced silently, looking at each other. Every corner felt like a new test, every shadow a warning. At the end of the room was an old fireplace. Shadows were drawn towards it, and the lights flickered around. Vanessa, trembling, approached the fireplace. Demi watched, holding her breath, and Keanu advanced, carefully scanning the surroundings. The entity now seemed to be directly monitoring our movements, measuring our steps, observing our decisions, and in that moment, we realized that this house was not just a location. It was the domain of an entity that tested our courage, awareness, and boundaries, constantly putting pressure on us. The fear on Vanessa's face, Demi's mixed anxiety, Keanu's vigilant composure, they had all merged under the entity's influence. Every step, every breath, every move was within the entity's awareness, and that awareness was steadily growing. I still remember that night. Fear and curiosity were intertwined with every step. The dark corners of the house, the flickering lights, and the movement of shadows now felt like a direct message from the entity. Vanessa Hudgens, Demi Lovato, and Keanu Reeves were beside me. They couldn't put what they saw into words. There was fear and shock in their eyes, but they were also trembling with the instinct for survival. We paused for a moment, holding our breath and listening to the silence. Vanessa had her hands tightly clasped. Demi was constantly scanning her surroundings, and Keanu was looking slightly behind him. Fear had immobilized them, but the curiosity in their eyes was still alive. This experience was affecting them not just physically, but spiritually as well. Each of them was simultaneously trying to predict what the entity would do in confronting their own fears. As we moved through the dark corridors of the house, we felt the entity's movements more clearly. Its presence was beside us in every breath, every step. But now there was not only fear, but also a kind of awareness. Understanding the entity's boundaries and not crossing them was the only way for us to survive. As we rounded a corner, the lights completely extinguished for a moment. Right then, Vanessa looked slightly behind her, the expression mixing fear and astonishment on her face reflected the gravity of the moment. Demi and Keanu silently looked at each other. Words were inadequate. We held our breaths. This house and the entity within it were not just a physical space, but a test that examined everyone's inner world. As we took our final steps, the presence retreated, as if it was releasing us, but still watching. Vanessa, Demi, and Keanu took a deep breath. Fear was slowly giving way to relief, but there was still a shadow in their eyes. The experience they had lived through had changed them. I understood then that they would never forget this night. Just like me, they would always remember it. If you too love these kinds of shocking and real paranormal stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. With every new story, be ready to face the unknown and be the first to discover the next terrifying event.